I could.
I could be wrong.
I could.
I could.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
I could be.
I could.
I could be wrong.
Could be.
I could be.
I could be. I could be wrong. Hey, welcome back to I Could Be Wrong. It's a podcast where Pastor Matthew and I sit down on a week-to-week basis and discuss different current events. These could be challenging things that are happening in the world that might be difficult to talk about, and especially things that are difficult to disagree about. And the hope behind this podcast is to exemplify to people and to show Christians how we can still communicate, disagree, have discourse, talk about ideas, and still do it with spiritual fruit, with kindness and care and love towards each other. Matthew, how are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Doing well. We decided to start these podcasts with a new segment where we just open it up with a hot take with little to no context. We're not going to talk about it again in the podcast. It's just an opinion. If you don't know what a hot take is, it's basically an opinion about something that's probably unpopular.
Right.
You want to start?
I do want to start. My hot take is the sounds of the city are better than the sounds of nature.
Sure.
All right. So
I heard you talking about this in the office this week.
Yeah. And as we were talking about, I go, this is my hot take this week. I was raised in the city, and I think nature, if you pause, okay, let me take a step back. When I was a kid, my dad grew up in Arizona, and so his family's from Arizona, and we went there, and we were like out in the desert. First time I ever saw the desert, and like live, like I've seen it in pictures, but from there, my dad said something like, "Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?" And as a kid, I thought, no, actually, it's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. But, as a kid, I was like,
sure.
I could tell he liked it. I'm like, yeah. But I think there are some things that, like, if you pause and actually look at, you can go, you know what? If we really think about this is true. Nature is, if you sit there and listen to nature, it is obnoxious how loud and annoying bugs and birds and different things are. And so, like, I was raised in the city.
You're breaking so many people's hearts right now.
So many.
It's like so many people's favorite thing to do.
Yeah, even people on staff, they're like sending out their resumes right now. Like
Right,
they're trying to find new jobs. They love nature. But here's the second thing. Here's my second hot take that's connected to this. I think actually the sounds of the city is technically the sounds of nature. Because if you look at a woodpecker like pecking, or like a beaver making a dam, or like anything that's making noise, like you're like, that's what they do. We're people, we're a part of nature. We can make noise. So like technically speaking, it's all nature. And I'm just saying the best sounds in nature are found in the city.
Yeah. Do you think a little bit of that has to do with where you grew up?
100%.
Is that 100%. Yeah. We were talking about this week where we both grew up in a city center where to me it's very peaceful. Like here,
it is. It's
I
like
just grew up
white
hearing
noise almost.
Yeah, white noise. I grew up hearing car alarms and people yelling and car doors slamming, and it just feels versus the alternative. There's something like I just went camping this last weekend. There's something about what people would consider peaceful, hearing all these bugs and birds. I can't stop thinking about how gross it is. Like, wow, I'm surrounded by more bugs than I ever have been in my entire life. And the only thing separating me is this small piece of canvas. And it's like, okay, this is great. I don't think it's that relaxing either. My hot take, it's one I've been, I love talking about with people, and just pushing off my opinion on people as often as I can. It's that the Cleveland Browns are the greatest football team of all time. And I know what you're thinking. And
stats don't support it.
Stats don't support it. In my lifetime, they don't. But I don't know if you knew this. Cleveland Browns are the most winning football team of all time pre the Super Bowl era. So back when people wore leather helmets.
How long ago is that? When is Super Bowl?
We're talking, I think, like the 40s. So we're talking the 30s, if I remember right.
So how many years of football was there before that?
You know what? There was only like 11, and
So
the
they were
Browns
really
won
good
the
for 11?
championship all 11 years. So if you just talk about championships, no one's won more championships than the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah.
They weren't Super Bowls because it was just the AFC. It's called the American Football League.
Now, Michael, you know that's wrong though, right?
No.
You know what? If you were to say like they're the best fan base, I could get in on it.
Not only are they the best fan base, mostly because, I think Clevelanders are great. I think Clevelanders are really awesome. But more than that, I like the history of it too. Paul Brown started the Cleveland Browns. He basically invented high school football, and that's why they gave him the job.
Hold on.
What?
Technically speaking, the team you're talking about is the Ravens.
I swear I will leave. I will get up.
I'm so glad you did that.
Get up right now and walk out.
But I'm just saying, technically speaking, that team
Dude,
left,
I
right?
don't want to talk about it.
So
if you don't know, back in the 90s, the Cleveland Browns were sold to the Baltimore Ravens, and the whole team, the coaching staff, the players, they all went and won a bunch of Super Bowls.
They weren't sold. They just changed their name and moved, right?
No, Art Modell, he couldn't get. If there's one person in American history that my dad would say he'd like, if he could resurrect somebody and beat him up, it would be Art Modell.
Like resurrect him to kill him?
Yes, exactly. There's such a loathing that my dad has. He told me when the Browns were sold, he's such an NFL fan. I was like, who did you watch? And he's like, nobody. I didn't watch a game for like 4 years. He was so devastated that the Browns were sold. Art Modell couldn't get a stadium deal done in Cleveland. He wanted a new one, so he sold him to Baltimore. Sold the whole team. So he didn't even own the team anymore. Just sold him and shipped him off. Yeah.
So how many years did Cleveland go without a team?
3.
Okay, that's
and then they came on. Still, yeah, it's not that bad, but they came on as an expansion, then as a brand new team with the Jaguars, who are great. No, I'm telling you, they're awful. Well, I think it was the Panthers too. The Panthers were the only one out of that expansion set that actually did well. I think I want to say it was the Panthers, the Jaguars, and the Cleveland Browns. The Browns being the only one that were already a team.
Yeah. It's actually kind of shocking that it only took 3 years. Honestly, if you think about it, like how many teams just like they lose a team and they never get one back
forever. Well, Baltimore, that was originally they had no team forever. I think they had the Oilers, Baltimore something. No, Colts. Baltimore Colts forever got sold to Indianapolis. Nobody cares about this, but right, got sold to Indianapolis. Didn't have a team for I think it was 20 years. There's no Baltimore team until they got one back in. They stole my team, and they drafted a guy named Ray Lewis, and then they won a bunch of Super Bowls, and I haven't forgiven them.
Yeah. I think that's the best part.
I hate
about
that whole
story
city.
To me is like that the Ravens won the Super Bowl. I don't think they won a bunch. They won.
No,
one,
it was 2. I think it was 2. It was when it was Joe Flacco and Ray Lewis.
Okay, because I know they went and they beat San Francisco, right? Because that's when Harbaugh was there. Jim and John were going against each other.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah. I want to say it was 2, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. The spirit of this podcast. Yeah. Okay. Today, speaking of I could be wrong, we are talking about student loan forgiveness.
Which is something we all agree on.
It's not at all divisive. This is everybody kind of has the same opinion. You actually made a Facebook post about this, would you say a month ago?
At least, yeah.
And it was just a reminder of like, every time I trick myself into thinking there's nothing left divisive to uncover.
Yeah.
COVID happened. We're not talking about it.
Right.
Black Lives Matter happens now. No one's really talking about it. The dust is settled. So it's like, oh, surely this won't be inflammatory. Let's talk about something simple like student loan forgiveness. And that post popped off.
Yeah. That was shocking to me because I have grown tired of Facebook engagement about anything important. So I purposely avoid it because it's just not a great, it's not a great venue to discuss things. Yeah. It's awful. So when I thought about posting, I got to remember the details about this because I think I've talked about this before, but I don't want to say something incorrect, but if I'm not mistaken, I went home and I was going to take a nap, and I just had it popped up on my phone or something, an alert that there was going to be loan forgiveness. And I know people who have student loans, like close personal friends of mine who have student loans and have had them for a long time. So I know the tension of it. And it just said they were going to be forgiven. And I didn't know any details at all. None. I didn't know a single detail about it. I didn't know if Congress had passed a law.
Right. Which, real quick, if you're unaware, if I remember right, it was an executive action executive order to relieve $10,000 off of anybody with a federal student loan. If I remember right, I think that was it.
Yeah, it was $10,000 for some, and I think there was another group that could somehow get $20,000. I can't remember the specific details about it. But yeah.
Okay, sure. So that was that. If you don't know what we're talking about, federal student loan forgiveness. That's President Biden, maybe 2 months ago now, passed an executive order to do that.
So, I was going to take a nap, and I saw it, and the first thought I had was I celebrate with those who are about to have their loan forgiven, and the post I made was generic enough that I think some people missed the point of it, of what I was specifically talking about, but it was specific enough that people got it. And what my post was, I probably should have just looked it up before this podcast, but I said something along the lines of it always makes my heart happy when someone who owes a debt is forgiven. So obviously it's a two-sided thing. I'm talking about one side but I'm also talking about us as Christians and our debt being forgiven.
Yeah.
That was it. So I post it and lay down to go to sleep, naive self. I wake up and it's tons of comments and stuff, private messages, and a lot of people liked it. A lot of people shared it. A lot of people hated it. People got fired up and you get the condescending things of oh, you're so naive and this and that. And people want to argue and they want to give their opinion on why this isn't scriptural and different stuff. And I was everyone relax. Again, note this, what I said, just if you just look at my words of what I said, I'm just happy when people have debt forgiven.
Right.
So I was not even giving my opinion on it. And we'll talk a little bit about today because at some point you're going to ask me my opinion, I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
Because that's what we do.
Sure.
We opinion. But you're going to ask my opinion on it, but I wasn't giving an opinion on it. I was literally just saying one element of this dynamic situation is some people are getting forgiven of debt. I'm happy for them.
Yeah.
Do I agree with it? I don't know. I'll tell you later. But right now I'm just saying I'm happy for them. So it was one of those things I realized, man, almost everything is people want to argue about, want to be divisive.
Yeah.
But here's, I want to say one thing. There was
sure.
one person who messaged me who has been very political and in the past. And so much so that I'm fairly confident at one point disconnected from our church because they didn't feel like I aligned or whatever. This person and their family are back, but they messaged me and said, like, that was such a good reminder to me of a different redemptive way to view that. Thank you for that. And I was like, wow, to me, it was like a cool moment as a pastor. I thought, yeah, you get it. That it's like
we can see past the politics side of this and appreciate the value.
And you can even not agree with the politics side of it and how it went about, but you go, oh, I found the redemptive side of it. And that's where my heart is. It's like, I think people, they just assume we're one side or the other, like 100% one side, 100% the other. They don't realize there's so much nuance to things that I can look at something and go like, golly, I hated the way that played out, but this part was redemptive. I celebrate that.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, so it was just a reminder to me that like where there's something to be made divisive, oftentimes when people are involved, we take sides and we dig our heels in, and that's just, and it's super easy to make camp there. And you know what was so interesting about that to me is where it felt like it was politicized, where it's not that surprising that like a conservative person might be frustrated because a Democratic president did it. But I know many conservatives are very anti-taxes. It's all about like how much money can I keep out of the hands of the federal government. It's very laissez-faire, hands-off economics. So I thought it was interesting to see a lot of my friends who are more conservative be against that forgiveness, where it's like, well, usually conservative people were like, let's keep the money in our hands. Let's give tax breaks. And that's where it can sometimes feel so hit or miss for me, where it's almost hard keeping track of like, wait a minute,
I agree.
Where are we going here? Because on paper, it felt like a conservative thing of like, these big federal, that's what they are. They're federal institutions. They're not private equity companies. They're federal institutions are making a lot of money on these things. And it's just like, okay, let's put it back in the hands.
So this might not be fair, but I'm going to say it anyway. This could be inaccurate, but doesn't it feel like if we would have just had this exact same thing happen, say 4 years ago when Donald Trump was in office, former President Trump was in office, if he did it, there'd be a large group that goes, now, man, he's a man of the people.
Yeah, right? Absolutely, yeah.
And so I agree with you.
Finally, get the hands away from the federal government. Let's get the money away from them. Yeah.
There are times that as like a person who I don't really identify on either side anymore because I feel like they're so extreme, that I am confused about, like, it almost feels like people have to wait until the politicians tell them this is what we're going to think. And they go, okay, that's the side I'm on now. And it feels like people have just lost the ability to just look at stuff with their own brains and their own thought to go, no, the more I look at this, I like that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's honestly, like, as we'll talk about it, as you start to dive a little bit more into this, I think a lot more people probably would actually agree with elements of this. Again, not all of how it's played out, but elements of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was a kid being really confused when I want to say it was my dad explained to me at the time, like I'm a child of the 90s, gay marriage was not legal. There were different things to kind of protect people in a tax sense of how they can still have like a domestic partnership, but gay marriage wasn't legal. And I remember I read a book. You know what? I don't even remember the book, but it's basically a don't trust the government book. It was like 1984, something like that. Like, Big Brother. And I remember being so confused and asking my dad, who I knew was a Republican. He would love if I said that. I'm not throwing him under the bus. He delights in being a Republican. He's a fan. But I remember asking him, I'm like, well, wouldn't Republicans be pro-gay marriage? Because it's the idea of like the government not telling you what to do. Because that's like, I was like, isn't this like?
He's like, you're grounded.
Yeah, he's like, you don't know what you're talking about, right? But it does feel like a hit or miss thing where it feels like if you were just to take a look at what core values of a different political party and line up policy, sometimes it doesn't quite make sense. And I don't know whether it be, big news or, media just like keeping people divided. I heard a really interesting opinion recently just about someone who's basically like, who doesn't argue about this stuff? Really wealthy people. Like they don't care. Like they don't care. They're hanging out. They want to keep, you divided because it makes, easier to get
like
stuff done.
That famous Dave Chappelle stand-up where he's like talking about Donald Trump and he's like, you guys think he's your president. He's not your president. He's my president. He's for the wealthy.
Yeah, as a rich guy, like he's for me.
There's like different. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So, okay. So if we're talking about student loan, like I said, if you don't know what it is, we're only talking about, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we're only talking about federal student loan. Is that correct? Right, so if you go to a private university, this doesn't apply to you. This is like, or if you got a federal loan to that private university, it might apply to you.
Yeah, I would say it's only federal loans. I think you can get federal loans
for private university.
I could be wrong on that, but I think you can.
Sure. So, but if you were to go to a private bank, this wouldn't apply. This is is for a federal loan. Yeah. And so that's why the president had, whether it's right or wrong, and we can talk about that a little bit today too, about executive, is it orders or actions?
I think it's executive orders.
Executive
I think
orders.
that's a
Okay.
technical term.
So whether executive orders, we've seen a big rise in that in the last
Yeah.
in the last 16 years, whatever the case might be, 20 years, where historically that's not super precedented. Is the executive branch just saying we're just going to pass a bunch of stuff? Usually it goes to the legislative branch and all this great stuff. But we basically saw through an executive action, executive order, President Biden forgive all this stuff without it going through any kind of approval through Congress.
Right.
This is just something that he passed off. We know that it applies to federal loans exclusively. Before we get into the rest of the conversation, I want to talk about what does this mean for us? What's our response? What do we believe? Whose responsibility is this? I want to talk about a couple numbers with university in general. I pulled up a graph. This is just the average cost of tuition. So this isn't total student loans that someone's accumulated. This is a 1-year cost for tuition. Historically from 1970 to 2021. And this is through the Education Data Initiative, the National Center for Education Statistics. That's who put this out. If you're interested, you can find it on educationdata.org. In 1970 into 1971, that year, a private 4-year education, so this would be, I don't know what's popular around here, but like Malone is a private university. I know that's popular in Northeast Ohio where I'm from. Any kind of a Christian or a Catholic school or anything like that is going to fall into this category. For 1 year, it would have been $1,700 in 1970. Now in 2020, it's $32,825. So that is a wild markup from what it was. You know what? I actually realized I said this wrong. This is not for 1 year. This is total that's total for a 4-year education. Okay. 4 years would have been $1,700 in 1970. Now for 4 years, it's $32,000. This is for the average student after grants, after assistance. Yeah. So that's a private 4-year. A public 4-year would have been, it looks like $187 in 1970, and now it is $9,377. Now that isn't going to include like any like your state colleges, everything from that to OSU. That's what that is. I can go over the 2-year ones as well. But what we see, if you can see the graph in front of me, we're talking about, it's not double, it's not triple, it's like 100 times in some of these cases where you see the amount of the price that colleges went up. Now, the reason why that matters and the reason why that's concerning is because the earning potential based off that degree is what we've seen has not increased that much. Right. So you and I both grew up. I don't know. I feel like this is a cultural change. But when I was in school, it was very much taught that if you want to be successful, you need to have secondary education. You need to go to college. You have to get a bachelor's degree. You have to at least get an associate's degree to be hireable, let alone you need a bachelor's degree and maybe even a master's degree for specific fields. That was so inundated. Now I think we're seeing a movement more where people are realizing that, no, you can go to a trade school and make way more money than anybody,
But that is a recent thing.
Say it feels super new.
Like, when I say recent, I'm saying like, to me, it feels like within the last 5 years, because we've seen it even with our kids in Fairfield Union that they're talking more about it. So the principal of the high school actually talks about it in very favorable terms. Like, not all of you should go to college. Like, there's other things. Yeah.
And I would have never been told that. And I went to an inner city school. I would have never been
told that.
And I should have been told that.
Right. And it was refreshing when I heard it. I was even shocked because typically it was people in the academic world kept stressing academics. So like you would have principals and teachers would stress college, and then you would have people more in the workforce saying like, but there's also the career center and stuff like that. And I would say one way that this is exposed is if you've ever gone to a high school graduation, when they ask them like what their future plans are, this is probably for some of the smaller schools. I don't know if they do this in all the big schools, but when you hear someone's future plans, it's very rare for someone to not say some form of education afterwards because it's almost like an embarrassment. Like you don't want to be stigma. Stigma. You don't want to be the kid that's like, no, I'm not going to college. I'm going into the workforce.
Not smart enough.
You're starting to hear a little bit more now, and every time I hear it, I'm refreshed by it. Like I'm like, good for you.
Yeah.
That's
go be a welder.
So like we were in our day and age, like you have to go to school. So basically, what was told us is, college is going to give you a better education, which is going to get you a better job, which you're going to make more money from, and more money equals better life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's what we were taught.
And that was what I was taught my whole life. If you want that better life, especially someone like me who grew up in what by mathematical standards, poverty, that felt right. I'm like, okay, so that's my way out. If I want to succeed, and my parents taught the same thing, and it's not that they were being like, my dad was a union steward at Chrysler for like 15 years. So he, in theory, should know like, no, you can go make okay money, working in a factory. Right. But even he fell into that trap of like, no, this is how you get ahead in life. You go to college and you go, and I said this right before the podcast started. For some reason, when I was in high school, Like if you're a guy, you need to go be an engineer. If you're a girl, go be a registered nurse, and then you'll make $60,000 a year, maybe more, depending on what you do past that. And it just felt like that was what you were taught. That was the move.
And if you made $60,000 a year when we were like 20 years ago, that didn't feel like middle class. That felt like upper middle class.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And now it feels like in many ways that wage is basically around the same way, the same level. And you don't feel upper middle class if you make that. You feel like we need two incomes in our home to survive.
You need two
be
people
better.
making 50 to 60,000 to be able to have like the lifestyle that you would want. Or that's marketed to you, right?
Yeah.
Like when you consider the American dream, that's the budget you need to get to have to own a home,
right?
To have a new car if you wanted to, or a new-ish car, something within 5 years, to be able to manage that payment. You need to be able to have that kind of wealth coming in. So for me, my whole life, I was taught, do you want that American dream? Do you want the cool car? And by cool, I just really mean like a new Camry. You know, I just mean like something really reliable and efficient. Do you want a nice car? Do you want something reliable? Would you like to be able to buy property? Would you like to be able to buy a house? You know where you would like to. All right, well, this is what it means. You have to go to school. And where that is troublesome to me is you're teaching this to people who, we got a conversation about this recently. I don't remember what podcast it was on, but when you're a kid, what adults tell you is fact. It's factual. Right. There's not a lot of, you have rebellious kids at times,
but even when you're rebellious, there's an element of your mind that goes, I mean, they're probably right, but I don't know if I want to do it, but
that's right. A super good point. You're rebelling because it feels good to rebel, but not because you necessarily think it's wrong. You're like, well, they're probably right, but that's not fun. And you just want to more act in rebellion. You're teaching this to kids where they just take it as fact. And that's where this conversation of student loan forgiveness comes in. And really, to even begin to talk about whether that's right or wrong, I think we need to talk about, have we set up a society where kids are graduating and falling into what I would call or what could be called predatory lending, where you're taught like this is the only route. All of a sudden they graduate and they have $30,000. I told you about a family member who has like $90,000 of school debt as a social worker. And that's some of the most beautiful, incredible community work you can do. It doesn't pay very well.
Right.
So kids are falling into this trap and have this insane amount of school debt. And now they're strapped with that for the rest of their life. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you can never file bankruptcy for that either, correct?
Right, yeah. So it's such a broken system. That's one of the things that annoyed me when people were engaging this topic on Facebook. And so I chose not to engage anyone. If they engaged my post, I would engage. But I'm saying other people were making posts, and I was just like, you haven't even studied this. 'Cause people would make comments like basically calling every single person that has student loans that's going to be forgiven, calling them out. Like they're lazy.
Like they're a moocher.
Yeah, they're a mooch. They're trying to work the system. And the irony of it is during COVID, when the government was basically just handing out cash through the country, I did not hear a single person give it back, right? Or refuse it.
Right.
But even then, so what they were saying is like, oh, it's their fault. And I thought, okay, stop for a second. If you can look at this with fair eyes, everything you just said, we told basically 14 through 18-year-olds, because that's when you really hear it is in high school. We told them, in order to experience a quality of life, you have to go to college. College during all of this time, the cost of college is increasing, as you've already gone through. So I'll give her on a practical note. So Mary and I are in this world because our son Cole is going to college next year.
Sure. So you're
this
really
is not, these are real numbers here. So we looked at a Christian college from the denomination that I was raised in and stuff like that. So we're talking like almost apples for apples, right? When I went to college in 97, it was $10,000 a year. It's $40,000 a year now. So Cole is,
and I know the two schools you're talking about, they're very similar.
Very similar, right? Yeah. And so Cole is a straight A student, going to be probably a valedictorian, salutatorian of his class, super sharp, smart kid, going to have all this stuff. So he's going to get tens of thousands of dollars in scholarships and grants and stuff like that. But so he's going to get all of that, and it's still like when we're looking at the numbers, potentially is going to be double what it was only 20 years ago. But so all that said is, so if it is $40,000, that's $120,000 for an education. Okay, so we're telling 14 to 18-year-olds, in order to have a higher quality of life, you have to go to college and get this debt, because unless you have wealth ahead of time and really, really plan well, you don't have, as parents, $120,000 sitting around in 4 years, right?
And you have 4 kids.
I have 4 kids. Yeah. So Mary and I have set aside, we're going to be able to pay for our kids' schools, but it's because Mary's working right now. Mary's working right now for the sole purpose of paying for our kids' college. 100% of her income just goes into a separate account. Yeah. So that's how we live our lives. Sure. You know what I mean? Like in preparation for that.
Which is, it's safe to say, not normal.
Not normal, right?
Most American citizens, and this is hard. This is a bummer. I'm not saying this is like, how great is this? most people live paycheck to paycheck on average. If you're talking about the average American citizen, the idea of having enough income to set aside for your kid going to school, and there's a bunch of reasons that can go into that, whether it just be bad financial planning, whether it be, generational, there's a ton of stuff. Most American people don't have that ability. They bought a house too big, they bought a car too big, or for whatever reasons, they don't have that kind of liquid income.
Right. And so Mary and I made good choices. Like our mortgage is not overwhelming to us. It's not even percentage of our bills. Like there's a lot of things that go in this. Okay. But anyways, you tell kids you need to go to school in order to have a higher quality of life. They then go accumulate debt. The government loans them money beyond their means. And that's the predatory lending. It 100% is that. Because a bank would never give those individuals, like people in general, and I'm saying like would have been my family growing up. I had student loans. I paid them off, but I had student loans when I went to college. A bank would never give that. The government will, and so they have debt. Then the government writes a law that you cannot declare bankruptcy on your student loans. Yeah. So now a person doesn't start with a better paying job and more income and a higher quality of life. They start with a job that it might be a little bit better, but it's like a decent job, but with all of that debt that they can never get away from. And so from that point forward, they're not able to accumulate wealth like a typical person, because if you have $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $30,000, whatever it might be, it now impacts your ability to get a loan to buy a house. It now impacts your ability to get a loan to buy a car or different things. But if you can't buy a house or a decent sized house or what you want, so now you're not accumulating wealth through real estate. You're not going to invest money, so you're not accumulating wealth that way. Most likely, you're not going to put as much away for retirement, so you're not even being as prepared for retirement. So like you're not able to accumulate wealth, which means most likely you're not able to pass that on to your children and or even pay for your children's education to fix the problem that you're experiencing. So now they're back in that same boat. And so now we're not just impacting individuals, we're impacting generations. So when people, this is like where I get passionate about, people wanted to highlight the person who fell into the system that we created and taught them, make them
that
the
they've been
guilty
inundated
party.
with since literally childhood, when your brain's not done developing yet.
Until you're in your mid-20s.
Yeah.
And so we want to blame them. And I think we need to take a step back and go, all right, should they pay back their debt? Let's address that. Okay. But let's take a step back and go, who created this system? Let's blame them. Who created the system? The government. Yeah. So at the same time, I'll say one more quick thing. At the same time, do you know why colleges, the cost is going up? It's because they know the students can get loans. If the students couldn't get loans, they would adjust their tuition to match that. So like I looked up a report. I was just trying to find some numbers. Ohio State just a few years ago made $700 million in profit in 1 year. And they have 66, they're like, I think the largest or the second largest college in the country. They have 66,000 students that are enrolled in their school right now. If you took that $700 million and just gave it back to all of them, that's $10,000 a student. So like, I'm just saying like they can reduce costs and not all of them would even need it. Yeah, they can reduce costs. So there's just this broken system that it's too simple of a side to say, let's blame those who took the loans.
Yeah, no, and it's lazy. And there's something that you just said that felt like even such a wake-up call in my own mind, because it feels so simple, where you just said like, would a private bank do that?
No.
You know why? You know what a private bank would require? You to show your 10-year plan of here's the job I will get that will make this much that will prove that I can pay this back. Then they'd probably make you find a cosigner, because it's like, well, just in case that doesn't work out. Some type of collateral. Do you have any kind of equity that we can leverage against? Which, as you were talking about, to build wealth, generally you need equity. It helps. So whether it be buying a home, for the great way to start generating wealth by gaining equity, so you can someday leverage that if you want to start a business or whatever the case might be. So you're looking at these kids who have no equity, they have no collateral, might not have a cosigner if they have parents who aren't wealthy, probably don't have parents that can help them. And then just saying no bank would allow that to happen, because they have the wisdom to say there's no way that's a safe investment on their part. But for some reason, in this unique situation with literal children whose brains aren't done developing yet, that's where we get the pass. And then where it does feel cruel is to say, and you can never file bankruptcy. Everything else.
Right. The government protected themselves. So they predatory lend, protect themselves. And so those same people that come out with debt, as we keep saying, not only can you not accumulate wealth, but you accumulate more debt. Because you don't have,
it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, you don't have cash flow. Yeah, and a lot of people, if you're not going through finances and or in the business world, you know how important cash flow is. And so like if my car breaks down and I need a new car, I don't have cash flow to buy a car because of all my debt. So for some people, many people, their student loan payment is equal to or close to their mortgage payment.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's like living with 2 mortgages. So I don't have cash flow for a vehicle. So how do I get a vehicle? It's another loan.
Yeah.
And so now I have a loan on a depreciating item that is I'm never gonna get back that money. And so now I'm paying on more debt. And then what happens when my water heater goes out? Well, I might need to put that on a Lowe's card. I might need to have a credit card. And now I have more debt.
Yeah.
And that's the world that's we're living in. And so like when the government needs to address this issue, it's not as simple as saying forgiving debt. And that's probably my main issue with all this is they have to go beyond that and say, okay, how can we fix this problem? Because it's not going to you're going to forgive one generation's debt. The next generation is going to reaccumulate it.
Yeah. And I think it's safe to say too, that most things are like that. I think a lot of times is where you see things get so divisive and people get so up in arms on Facebook is because they're not looking at everything that you just said.
Right.
They're not looking at the whole picture. And I don't say that to say like, and we do, like I'm not trying to stand in arrogance, but the reality is most people aren't looking at this wide view.
Yeah.
They're looking at, oh, that doesn't seem fair. I had debt and I paid it off. Why does this person get to do it? Without taking in the entire scope of like, whoa, this is actually a really, really complex issue that seems to marginalize and impact a lot of young people at a high level. And where it feels so silly to me, okay, well, I don't want to just whine, but I might just like gripe here for a second. Where it feels so silly to me is that we would call ourselves Americans and call ourselves in the tribe that is America. We fly this flag. We say that we support each other in that. That's literally what taxes are for, is to fund the federal government to take care of each other. That's a huge part of what the government does, is to care for its citizens, to build roads, to do all this great stuff. And we call ourselves Americans and we celebrate the national anthem, and we stand and we take off our hats and we celebrate our Americanness. The idea of then crippling the young people of your country, who are literally the future of your country, I've never made sense of that, where regardless of where you are politically, to not say, wow, every extra dollar we get, let's fund into public education. Let's fund into, or something like this. Let's take care of the young people who are now going to go on and build the country. And then we get into this place now where it's like, make the country great again, or keep it great, or we have all these problems to solve, where it's like, okay, but at what point do we love the country enough and the people enough to say, let's fix some of the problems while they're kids. Let's not strap people. Let's not cripple the upcoming generation so they don't have a country that they have to fix. You want to know a quick way to solve the problem of like, oh, we have all this, not a quick way. That was like way oversimplifying it. We have all this poverty. We have all this generational poverty. We have people who take from the system. How do we fix that? We could dump money on it via entitlement programs, which is, there's temporal needs. I understand that. But at what point do we say, let's stop crippling the upcoming generation so that they don't have to deal with this issue? But then we just get, I always thought it was interesting. It's like the comparison of, I always thought it was weird when grandparents or older people or people who have had kids complain about the upcoming generation. Where I want to tell them, I'm like, well, they're just kids. Like, who taught them that? You know what I mean? Oftentimes it's the generation complaining about it, where it's like someone taught them to act that way. Like someone enabled them and empowered them and taught them that's appropriate behavior. And so to be angry at them and to be, oh, millennials are so this. And I want to look at, Gen X and baby boomers and be like, who do you think taught millennials to do that? Like, I had parents, I had grandparents. Feels the same thing with finances. We want to be upset about upcoming generations, about their, they're spending too much money on avocado toast and they're doing all this stuff, but we don't want to make any meaningful steps to help them create a financially viable life where they can accumulate wealth, which should make the country better. In theory, the more money citizens have, the more money they can spend, the more money then can be taxed, the more it booms the economy, grows small business. And again, it's easy to be upset when you look at a micro view and say, wow, that doesn't seem fair. The moment you start taking into account, what does this actually mean for America? What does this actually mean for young people? How does this apply? That's where I feel like sometimes we lose sight of that. And I think that can probably apply to most issues we talk about on this podcast, of looking at this micro view of like, how does this make me feel versus what are the big implications?
Very well said, Michael. I totally agree. I think I actually wrote in my notes something similar to what you said. I was like, America needs to start thinking of itself as a unit again. Like you're talking about, like, we sing the national anthem, we're under the flag, but yet then we all act as individuals willing to eat each other, destroy each other and a future generation. So like even right now, this generation is accumulating more national debt than any in human history, $15 trillion right now, and passing that on to the younger generation that we're also strapping with student debt. So, and then we want to, like you said, look at the millennials and complain. We want to look at the next generation that we're destroying and judge them and mock them and make fun of them. And I'm like, they're living out the system that we created. So like you and I, we're both 8 on the Enneagrams. We're high capacity leaders. in our environment, we are systems minded. So whenever something's broken, it's because the system is broken.
Messed up. Yeah.
And so we're trying to figure it out. And so like for us, we look at this and we go, we do want to take a step back and go, okay, in this are people that are being hurt. Yeah. So like we are compassionate. So
and
we
mind
look
you,
at
we work at a church too, so we have
Yeah.
firsthand access to the people who are victims to this, to
Absolutely.
poverty-stricken people frequently.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And it impacts not just people in poverty; it impacts our coworkers.
I agree.
Like
Yeah.
I'm not going to like throw someone out there because they haven't given me permission, but there are people on staff that have student loans. Like so, like all of this dynamic is we're looking and we go, first of all, there's people, but then we take a step back and go, okay, we love these people, we're compassionate for these people, but we also want to look at the system. And so, like for us, it's not that we have everything figured out, but we'll take a step back and look and do research before we form an opinion. I'm not going to have my opinions told to me by a political party.
Yeah.
I'm so beyond trusting a political party to have my best interest at heart.
Yeah.
I'm so beyond expecting a news agency that is in it for profit
Sure.
to tell me my information that I go, you know what, I can look at these things for myself. And the more I look at it, the more I see the systematic problem that we need to fix. And so that's where we should be putting our energy, not just belittling one group or bad-mouthing one group and, being upset because their loans are forgiven. We should take a step back and go, okay, let's start calling our politicians into account on these things. And we need to see legitimate change to this.
Yeah. I don't have this in my notes, but I think for anybody who's interested, who listens to this podcast in like church leadership or how this is a parallel, I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on your strategy as a lead pastor and like the primary vision caster of this church. You see this problem of like, hey, I'm not going to cripple the upcoming generation. Mm-hmm. Does that impact the way you do ministry, the way you view kids ministry, youth ministry, the way because what's a really easy thing to do is look at how we allocate funds, whether it be our tax dollar or whether it be how we use money we have in the church. Mm-hmm. What is your value system as like when you create literally the future of our church? Does that make sense?
100%. So everything we think about, so like, okay, let's just talk about the church thing. There's two elements that impact. So you didn't prep me for this. So this is off the top of my head.
It's in my notes. Yeah, sorry.
But there's two elements that we know that the behavior now impacts the future. So one behavior now is financial. If we accumulate so much debt, like I'm going to be a part of paying off some of it potentially, but potentially another generation is going to pay off debt. So like we have two projects that we're working on. That said, I'm not going to go into all details now, but there's a good chance that we're going to be able to eliminate all that debt like within a short amount of time. Like that's our strategy, because even though like you look at, building projects, they're big and stuff, we know that can impact current ministry and future ministry, and we don't want to do that. So there's one way is financially.
Yeah.
So like there's, again, this isn't the venue that I want to explain all that. Yeah. But so we're looking at financial debt. Second part about it though is also cultural. We want to create a ministry that continues to impact future generations. So for us, we put young adults and young leaders in key positions to influence culture and the way that we present the gospel, not changing the message, but changing the delivery system. And because I know that I'm not going to be relevant forever to every generation. So even though I know God's gifted me in communicating, and I'm confident that as long as God has me as a lead pastor, I'm going to have his anointing, I'm going to be able to communicate. But I also recognize there are other elements that are going to attract future generations. So like when I talk, and I've talked with churches that have got to the place where they have literally zero children's ministry. Not a single child is coming, and they go, we want to revamp our ministry. And I think you have to go back in time 30 years ago to make the changes you need now. At this point, I don't have any solution for you except find another young and healthy church, pass on your building to them. And that sounds harsh, but you get what I'm saying. So like for us, so financial debt, we pass on to a generation. Culture, we pass on to a generation. And then the next part is even when a church is built around a primary leader. So like for me, I'm the lead pastor. There's a lot of talk in the church world now about transition. Mm-hmm. And so like I know, even though I'm 43 years old, within a decade, I will be thinking transition.
Sure.
And I don't know when or if or how I'm going to retire, but what that looks like, because it's not built around a personality.
Right.
It's built around like a ministry and a system. So in all of those situations, I'm constantly thinking, even though right now I'm fine, we're fine financially right now, we're fine in culture right now, I'm fine as a primary leader, I won't always be in all those areas.
Yeah, sure.
And so like we are thinking ahead, and that's what we need now in our government. That's what we need in our families even, is to look forward and say, because like I'm thinking about for my own kids, all the things that we didn't have in school taught, we now know. And so I'm thinking about how to get my kids set up like with one foot as an advantage. So like how we're going to use those resources to create investment accounts for them now before they're out of high school, so that like that's the ultimate gift. If I can set up accounts and start putting money into them so that when my kids hit those ages where now they're having to pay for their kids' college and different stuff, and I have an account set up that's been, accumulating interest all those years, that's what we can do now, because I want to fix for the future generation what was broken for me.
Yeah, and how hard and I'm not even going to say hard. How impossible is it to do that if you're just angry at,
right?
You know what I mean? At them getting something. Well, I didn't have it that way. So imagine if that was your posture. I can't speak to what your parents did, but I'm assuming not all of that. Was I say not all of it? Maybe some of it, not all of it. So for your parents, so you could easily go, my parents didn't do that for me. Yeah. Why would I do that for my kids? You know what I mean? Why would I? Just to be angry, be like it's
turned out all right. Let my kids.
They can figure it out. And I'm not trying to. I don't know. I'm not trying to like dunk on anybody. That's your philosophy in life. But what I know is it goes back to that. If I'm going to call myself an American citizen, if I'm going to say we're all in this together, if I'm going to say that that we the people, that all these people have equal value in this country, all this stuff, at what point do we love those people enough to want to see people succeed?
Right.
And so that goes back to that Facebook post where it's like, that to me feels like it's something worth celebrating, And even like I said, even when we think about the way I have 3 young kids who are now in our kids ministry in some capacity, whether it be nursery or Darby's in the preschool class now. And I almost have like a new pair of eyes looking at our church. When I walk into our church on Sunday, where before my kids, I want like more worship space. I want more lights. like I want
for the kids.
No, yeah.
I mean,
now it does. Right. Before that, before kids though, it's like that's how I would want to spend it. I want the auditorium better.
Yeah, okay, I get what you're saying.
Let's spend $100,000 make the ceilings higher so I can get better sound. Now it's just like, no, let's put more money into the kids ministry, which 4 years ago I'm like, man, that's not like, I don't really care. But now that's such a value.
Yeah, we're building a youth center right now. I have 3 kids in the youth group. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It has nothing to do with that, but yeah.
No, but that's really it. Where now I walk into our space and I literally see you. This could be a made up stat, but from my observation, it literally looks like as is probably 60 or more % of our building is allocated just to kid space. Easily. Like if you just look at square footage. Like we have a decent sized auditorium that seats 1,000 people if need be, but we have like also massive kid spaces.
Yeah.
Before I had kids, that felt gratuitous. I was like, do we need that? Now that I have kids, I'm like, thank goodness that the leaders of our church had the wisdom to know to invest that where I was still very young and wasn't thinking there yet. I was more thinking in the temporal of like, no, let's create a better. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. Yeah, I think the posture. We're coming from a spiritual perspective, but I would say even the posture as American, which you've said, is you have to recognize. So when I wrote in my notes, we have to think of ourselves as a unit. Here's in biblical language, God inspired Paul to write that we are a body. And the idea that when one part of your body suffers, the entire body suffers. So like he wanted us to view the church as a unit. So, and we know this, like if you get an infection in your hand, you don't just go, well, that's the hand, but the rest of me is good. You know that infection is going to eventually impact your entire body. Like obviously COVID, we saw that, like a small germs that we couldn't even see, a virus goes into our body and impacts every single thing. There's no difference in America. It's like the whole thing of like, we're in this boat together. Like that phrase is the idea that if this boat sinks, we all sink. Yeah. And so like, let's not do behavior that sinks the boat because we're in together. That's how it is even for us as Americans. So even if you take the spiritual side of it out, to resent people bettering their life is to resent your own body in that analogy. You know what I'm saying? Like,
100%. Yeah.
And so, and here's what we're not saying. We're not saying every element of this is great how it went about. And I would love to get into some of that specifics if we can continue this conversation. But I'm just saying, like, if you start from anger, you start from resentment, you start from like just being defensive, you won't take in new information and you won't have a compassionate and open-minded perspective. You don't learn, and I don't think it's a healthy way. I think when you just take a step back and go, first, let's look at the human side of this. Let's then think about from the human side, you start to have a healthier perspective, and then you can start to critique how things played out, what can be better. But if you take out the human side and just buy into a political argument, in my mind, that's boring. Right?
Yeah, it's super missing boring. The point. It's super boring, and I think it's bad for everybody. Like, at risk of beating a dead horse, I actually heard a story recently. Do you know where have you ever heard of Easter Island?
I've heard of it, but I don't know why.
It's this really mysterious island where there's these like all these statue heads like that are really symmetrical and like in the middle of nowhere. People are like, how did people?
Like what country?
Can't tell you. It's an island. It's not even connected. It's so far off of a coast that's actually the problem point. And they found these beautiful statues and you know, anthropologists and people, I don't know who else is in that field. People like that.
Geologists?
Yeah, geologists, I don't know. Archaeologists, people like that. Been so baffled of like, how did people even get to this island? And how did they build this great stuff without tools? And here's what they discovered over time is they cut down all of their trees and couldn't leave. So now it's there's no one who lives there. They have evidence that people were there for a long time, but they cut down their last tree to make a canoe or multiple canoes to try to get out. Didn't make it and left everybody else because they couldn't come back with more boats. And that's how those people, like, that was their demise. It wasn't sustainable enough. They cut down all their trees. Yeah. And I think about that.
That feels like a Aesop fable or something.
It
like
does.
Doesn't
it feels very poetic and very, it's like, where for me, I think about that and I'm like, right, what's the version of us cutting down all of our trees? I think about our kids and it's like, man, like I don't want.
It's accumulating debt and then training the next generation to be in debt.
Just to keep doing the same thing. And it's just like, it's literally falling into debt over and over again, and then everyone being grumpy rather than helpful. So it is at risk of being. I just thought that was an interesting comparison. So that being said, I think we've done a good job explaining why we need to be aware of this problem and why there's validity in saying how can we help people who are strapped with this debt. Where does the anger come from? Where does the frustration of people having debt from a system standpoint? How did it go down in a way that might be, hey, the thought might be good, but it could be dangerous? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of the anger comes about. One part, if we're just being honest, is just the political side of it. There is a bent now in our culture that whatever the other side does, we immediately demonize it. So it's that, and we get a lot of people playing on our emotions. The other side of it is there is an element when you set someone free from a debt that it feels unfair, especially if someone didn't afford you that same grace at some point in your life.
Sure, yeah.
So if you had debt and paid it off and now this person has debt and gets forgiven, that feels unfair. And even different types of debt. So like the apples to apples is I had student loan, you have student loan, I paid mine off, you didn't, you get yours forgiven. So
are you going to give me $10,000 in credit? Or are you going to now reimburse me? Totally.
So that's apples to apples. Apples to oranges, but yet similar is the person who goes, you know what, I didn't go to college, but I took out a small business loan and I've now created jobs and different things, and that loan wasn't forgiven. Are you going to forgive my student, my small business loan? Yeah. And you go, and that's where, like, in my notes I've been put, like, I wish we would have done that. I wish there would have been not either or. I think it would have been cool to do both and. Yeah. To say, like, we're going to help this generation. So I think there's a lot of anger because they're going, like, that's not fair because let's just be honest, and you know this well because you write about this in your music and you speak about it. Grace is unfair. Grace is, it can be frustrating even at times, like when one person gets it and one person doesn't. So there is that tension with it. And then how it was done is the other part, because in some ways it was done in a way that's never been done before with the executive order. So like, one of the things that people incorrectly said online is that he didn't have the right to do it. And you're like, well, no, technically he did. Yeah, like he can make an executive order because no one has ever set that precedent to do an executive order on that level. Then, it's shocking. And here, I'll say this, I'll clarify. It's legal until it's not. So like he did an executive order. Executive orders, as I understand them, and when I've studied it, is an executive order until the president who wrote it cancels it or stops it, changes it, tweaks it, or whatever, or the next president comes in, can actually write an executive order directly against an executive order. So like they can do it that way. It can be deemed like unlawful by the Supreme Court or a ruling court. So people are suing right now, and if they deem it unlawful, then he didn't have the right to do it. But that's the system. Yeah. So sometimes when we say illegal, like it sounds like it's criminal. He didn't break a law, but it might be deemed that he didn't have the right to do that. Yeah. And then the other way is Congress can write a law that will go against it. But with that, this is the odd dynamic. Congress would have to make a law, and he could veto it. And so in order to overcome a veto, you have to get 2/3 vote. Yeah. So
which is difficult to do.
It's very difficult to do, especially because it's basically 50-50 and has been for a long time. Yeah. So with that, it's like he used the executive order. Here's my opinion. You didn't ask this, but I'm going to tell you.
I'd love to hear it. My
opinion is I don't love that. I don't love executive orders on this scale because it feels like a dangerous precedent that now, and I don't know the numbers. Do you know the numbers? How much is this going to cost?
Total?
Yeah,
no,
total. Okay, I don't know those numbers. But like that seems like a bad precedent because then the next president can come in and there's some anger and frustration. Like if you want to really think the worst of someone, here's what you think. President Biden just bought a lot of votes.
400 billion.
400 billion with
Biden's student loan forgiveness plan will cost 400 billion. The budget office says, this is NPR.
Yeah.
The cost of the White House, but yeah, then it just goes to say it different ways. $400 billion.
Okay, and that's a lot of money, right?
That's a lot of money. Yeah.
And so, like, for a person to do that, and then the next president comes in, and like I said, if you want to really demonize it, you go, he's just buying votes, right? That's the person who wants to look at it and like not trust at all. But then the next president comes in, and what does he want to spend $500 billion on? Mm-hmm. You know, so now he's going to write an executive order to fix bridges, you know, or whatever. And so, my opinion is that's a negative precedent.
It's scary because where does that $400 billion come from?
Right.
My tax money. Well, not
right.
I don't have $400 billion, but it does come from my tax money in part, and usually that tax money is represented by Congress. That's why we vote for people in the House of Representatives and Senate so they could pass that stuff. It's all about, I want my money well represented, not just by the executive branch. I want it to be represented by all of our government structure. So I understand how that's a pretty scary feeling of like, well, you just bypassed all the people that I elected to protect essentially what's my investment into our country that is not even optional. Like we legally have to make that investment via taxes.
Yeah. And I like the idea in general of executive orders. I really do, because like we spend so much energy electing a president. They should have authority to make changes in different things.
Sure.
I love the idea that a president can declare war because and then Congress has a certain amount of time to approve it, because you need a president to be able to act today if a country bombed us or did something. But I like the idea of Congress having to approve it. I wish that all executive orders had that element of it. And I don't know exactly, I'm not going to solve all the problems, but like if you're going to spend so much amount of money, then Congress has to approve it within
X
60
amount of time,
days or 6 months, where there can be some debate about it. So like in this situation, he made an executive order. I don't love that. I love the byproduct of it, in the sense I'm happy for people that are getting loans forgiven. I'm unapologetic about that.
Sure. And you would even say, so to the people who would say, hey, that's unfair. Like, you know, that should go to people with a small business loan. That should go. Your response isn't, well, too bad. You're like, I agree. That stinks. That doesn't take away from this, though. I'm still glad this happened.
Yeah.
I wish more would. Is that safe to say?
100%. Yeah. In my mind, I go, of all the ways that we spend money. So like people get tripped out about this, but like President Biden, they passed this incredible infrastructure bill. You can't look at our infrastructure and not realize it needs to be upgraded, right? So like there's like elements of that gets me excited. So like in some degree, like that money is going to be put into the middle class also, because the middle class is a lot of the workers and people that are going to be implementing that. There's money that's going into getting technical jobs and stuff. Like I know Ohio's going to benefit from that with the Intel plant and all the jobs. And so like I'm happy for all of these things, because all of these things have the potential for people, like people's lives to be better. So I'm happy for that. I can look at something and go, systematically, I don't love how it went about, but that doesn't change the fact that when people are blessed by it, I can be happy with that.
Yeah.
And I can even vote a certain way. I can be happy about this and go, but I'm not going to vote for that candidate because I don't like the way it went.
Yeah.
You know, and people like in their mind like, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. I don't have to demonize everything. In my mind, I can go, no, I can celebrate some things and some other things.
That's a super good point. Yeah. And you also don't have to let every little thing like dictate where that vote goes. That means, well, because I like this, now he's earned my vote. No, you can still be like, I thought that was great. I still don't know that this is the best for the future, that you're the right person. There's so much nuance to that. And I think at times people are so not willing to engage. I mean, you want to talk about the lack of nuance. I saw it was a horrifying commercial because it was not nice, but I saw a commercial where it was basically people upset about the student loan forgiveness, like different people in Congress. The whole commercial was them putting how much money they took in PPE loan. And just said, that's it. You know, basically saying like, are you sure? Are you sure you're against federal, you know, the federal government giving you money? Or if you're against the stimulus, like, well, you took this. And where we have to be able to participate in the nuance of that, of saying, if you don't know what the PPE loan is, I mean, you could explain that way better than I can. But basically, it's just this idea that the federal government gave people money to cover a salary for
salaries during COVID because businesses shut down,
and they wanted to protect businesses because that's legitimately the lifeblood of America.
If they didn't do that, it would have crippled economy in America.
We wouldn't have bounced back as quickly as we have.
I mean, they gave away so much money, trillions of dollars during COVID.
Yeah,
and again,
to individuals and companies,
Yeah,
whether it be PPE or stimulus checks. Yeah.
it's like the percentage of people who didn't receive some type of help in some capacity is so small.
Yeah.
So we get it. At times, the government is big enough that it needs to use its resources to bless people, to fix problems.
Yeah. And we can appreciate the nuance of that. Yeah.
And I can, yeah. And like, I mean, I felt that way about healthcare.
Sure.
I've talked about this in a previous podcast. That was one thing where my mind was changed,
Yeah.
where I was against universal healthcare until I thought about when President Obama in his book, and I read all the former president's books. So
Sure.
I'm not, I don't vote liberal, just for those. And I don't know why I feel like I have to say that, because I don't want the headache of it. But
Sure.
But in his thing, when he said, countries get to a certain place where like you just provide services, you provide police, you provide ambulance. We should provide healthcare. And I went, you know what? Yeah. And I can be happy for those who have healthcare. And so for those who even want to make the argument, well, it's my tax dollars. And I go, okay, guys, let's just pause for a second. Let's look at this. Our tax dollars get misused all the time, but yet also get used in a really appropriate way too. So like I talk to like firefighters in our church, and they're like, and especially the ones that are in EMT, they'll tell me some of the funniest and the worst stories about, there are people that basically use EMTs as taxis. Like they know, like this, like they told me examples of the people that they have all the time to fake heart attacks to get a ride to the hospital because it's near their grocery store. And so they'll drop them off, they'll walk out. There's no consequence. That's tax dollars being misused, right?
Yeah.
But would any of us say like shut down EMTs?
Fire all the EMTs?
Yeah, right. You go,
never.
no, because there's a lot of good.
Yeah.
And so like there is that dynamic of where you go, yes, I get it. It's annoying that it's our tax bill. I have to do it. Yes, I wish Congress would better represent us. All of that's true.
Yeah, well said.
But at the same time, I can recognize there's a lot of good coming out of this. And so like I think about the people that you take $10,000 of debt off of their plate, what potential game changer can that be for them? So
Sure.
if you take $10,000 off of it, and you have to remember, these aren't amortized over 30 years, these loans. So like if you said a $10,000 mortgage, you go like, well, what's that? Just a few bucks a month over 30 years.
Yeah.
These loans are oftentimes 5 years, and it just keeps perpetually building on them. So like you take $10,000 out of that payment that was large now becomes smaller.
Yeah.
Now that person can start to build a rainy day fund. They can start investing more. They can even just have more joy as a family.
Yeah.
Right? They have a little bit more margin. To me, I go, man, if my tax dollars provided that, even without my vote, because an executive order was done, okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
No,
and that's really more of my Christian perspective.
Well, yeah, well, that's where I want to go next. So I think we kind of answered I had a question here. If you take the Bible out of the equation, what's your belief? I think just from a logistic view, I think we covered that pretty well. Of like looking at, if we believe in investing in the future, this is what it looks like. If you want to speak to that more than you can, but I'd love to end on really this big question. What does the Bible, if anything, tell us about this? And then with that in mind, as a Christian, how should we respond to it?
Yeah, so it's a complex issue. And when you take the Bible gives us truths on how to think and how to feel. It doesn't always, we can't go like take it and just apply it right to our political system, because the political system is not a biblical system.
Yeah.
And so as the scripture tells us how to think and feel, one thing is so clear in scripture is it celebrates generosity. So God celebrates that.
Yeah.
Jesus wants us as Christians to have an eternal perspective. So an eternal perspective is able to live in the tension of what's broken in our world, knowing it is broken. So like my ultimate goal is not the now, and it's not the better America. I want America to be better because I do love America. I live in America, but my hope and my goal is not for that. My ultimate goal is heaven. And so I want to live in such a way that it brings as many people to Jesus as possible. I want to live in such a way that honors God. I want to live in such a way that my eternity is blessed. I mean, scripture even talks about that, of storing up treasures in heaven. So the actions we make here on earth actually are going to have an eternal impact for us in our existence in eternity. We don't know exactly what that looks like, except that scripture just tells us over and over, not only when you obey God now does he bless you now, but he blesses you for eternity. Okay, so I have an eternal perspective. The Bible celebrates generosity. The Bible celebrates the releasing of debt, but you do it because of a faith perspective. So there was interest-free loans. The Jews were commanded within their own culture,
which is crazy,
to give interest-free loans to anyone who needed it. They were commanded, like we looked at this in great detail when we did our Bible study through Deuteronomy. but in great detail, they were talked about how you're going to treat people. So like if they are borrowing money and you need collateral, don't take things that they need to function and live. So if they need a grinder for their weed, if they need their jacket to stay warm, don't take that as collateral. Like don't disrespect them, allow them to still have quality of life, interest-free loans. Then on top of that, every 50 years with a year of Jubilee, God said, just forgive 100% of debts. If anyone had to sell land to you in order to survive, you give their land back. Anyone that sold themselves into indentured servanthood or slavery, you release them. You don't do that because it makes financial sense. You do that because of faith. Yeah. And so like even now I would say, so the biblical perspective of our lives is we can be okay with celebrating generosity. We can be okay with releasing debt, not because we think it was legal, not because it made financial sense, not because it made political sense. We can be okay with that because we have an eternal perspective. These individuals' lives are better, and I'm happy for them, okay? Now, as Americans and as a Christian, I'm a Christian who's American, I have a right to engage my political system, and there's nothing sinful about that. Sure. I have a right to discuss it and to explain I don't like that system. I'm being really clear. So I've said this, but I'm being clear. Yeah. I don't like the idea of a president having that much ability to make an executive order for hundreds of billions of dollars. I like the check and balance system of Congress. And I think executive orders and the whole need to get 2/3 votes so that you can't veto it, that doesn't feel like checks and balance. That feels like a loaded system. I don't like that, okay? Yeah. I can speak that. That's not sinful. I'm not even undermining authority because that's the rights we have as citizens. Now, if I call the president a moron or stupid, that's disrespectful. That's sinful, okay? So I can engage the process. I can choose who I'm going to vote for. I promise you I will not vote for President Biden. There's too many things that I just don't agree with. Sure. Student loans, that wasn't the deal breaker of it, but there's a lot of things in there. It's okay for us to engage the process, but I'm not going to be bitter. I'm not going to isolate other people in relationships. I'm not going to attack people who do like him and like the things. I'm going to have an eternal perspective. So all of that blends together. I hope that answers what you're asking.
No, it really does. And I think that if I were to name this podcast anything that wasn't I could be wrong, it would be like eternal perspective, because I feel like that is often what we come back to. Like, I can be frustrated with the way that a political system breaks down. Right. I can be profoundly frustrated with the way a president acts, whatever they might be doing, a law they might pass. Same thing with Congress. And that is honestly, we've talked about this before, where it gets so frustrating is like almost everybody agrees that our political system is corrupt and broken and has all this, and yet we put a lot of faith in it. Yeah. And I feel like oftentimes what we come back to is just saying, no, I have an eternal perspective. Like my eternal perspective makes me celebrate things that I normally wouldn't celebrate. It makes me spend money the way I wouldn't. Like, I tithe to a church. It makes me do so many things in life that I wouldn't normally feel compelled to do. And that internal perspective informs how I feel about things like this. Because at face value, this is silly. At face value, I'm like, don't take my money. You know what I mean? Yeah. At face value, it's justice. Specifically, I've had student loans, or my wife has. So from that perspective, I'm like, hey, I worked really hard. I could feel that same entitlement and frustration. I wouldn't be wrong in doing so. That eternal perspective changes everything for me. It changes the way I talk to people. It changes the way that I celebrate people. And that is where, like, I feel like so many of these issues come back to. And every time I find myself polarizing people or getting on Facebook and making an enemy out of somebody and saying like, oh, if you support this, or I can't believe these people are taking this money, or whatever the case might be, I always want to check my heart, and or going the other way, or being like, oh, all these crazy conservative people are so angry that this happened. I want to check my heart and have that eternal perspective of these are my brothers and sisters in Christ. If we disagree, they're still my brother and sister in Christ. Yeah. And if they're getting loans forgiven, good, because they're my brother and sister in Christ. And I can say politically, I think that's silly. I'm comfortable with that. If that's your belief, we've talked about both sides. I think that's great, but more than anything, it's the eternal perspective that informs the way that I act and operate. And I think that's where, as Christians, and as specifically, I love how often you emphasize it. I'm a Christian who's an American. That's where I want to see our culture change. Is I want to see people celebrate. I want to see people celebrate that and celebrate each other's joy and their ability to do better in life, whatever that looks like.
It doesn't. Yeah. No one can hear what you just said unless you're unhealthy. I'll make this a loaded statement. Sure. No one can hear what you just said and think that's a worse America, where we celebrate each other's victories, where we would go, you know what? Yeah, we're going to agree to disagree on some things. We're just going to disagree on some major things. But I don't have to wish evil upon you. I don't have to wish your demise. I can celebrate when things go well. And I know for me, like as an American, a Christian that's an American, my backer is not the American government. My backer is the creator God. So like
Wow.
that, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
that's why, like if my taxes, like, they can go up or go down. Like obviously I want them to go down.
Sure.
I'm for lower taxes. Okay.
Yeah.
But it doesn't like rob my peace. Like
Yeah.
there's just so many things about it that I really do feel like the more I grow in faith and maturity, I just learn to chill about, because God is so faithful.
Yeah.
And I really don't. This sounds like such a loaded statement. I don't want to get to heaven and find out that I compromised relationships for temporary issues, where people I could have influenced to get them to heaven, you know, like people where I could have influenced them in a way that would have brought them closer to Jesus. I just don't want to ever find out that I chose to fight for the temporary instead of fighting for the eternal. Yeah. And I think that's the perspective we have to consistently have.
Yeah, that's so good. Before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to say? Anything else besides that?
Yeah, so I think here's a better system we could have done, all right?
I'd love to hear it, yeah.
Here's a couple of quick things. I think at the minimum, they can turn student loans into interest-free loans. So if you're going to give away money, or if they're going to like give away $400 billion, let's lose $400 billion in interest payments, but so the people still pay it off, but it's not accumulating debt. So
you're not kicking a dog while they're down. If we did give them a predatory loan, let's forego interest.
So if they're going to pay $250 a month or $500 a month,
yeah.
It goes toward the principal and it goes down, right?
Yeah.
So like I'm for interest-free loans. More loans for small businesses, and I would even say interest-free loans for small businesses, because I don't think we should reward education over not inventions, but creating of jobs, like entrepreneurial. I think both of those should be celebrated, and I think they could fix this problem in a second if they allowed bankruptcy, because I promise you how they loan money would change, and it would change in that they would loan people less, and if people are loaned less, they can't go to college. I promise you, college costs will come down,
right?
Because it is a business. You call it anything you want. Even the colleges that say they're a nonprofit, it is for profit, for business, and you'll see costs come back down. The fact that the government is funding with an open checkbook, I think that's why prices are going up.
Yeah, people very rarely file bankruptcy on reasonable loans.
Right.
You know, this sometimes they do because of tragedy
or
horrible money management.
Right.
Usually, a reasonable loan, people don't actively try to do that. It's only when it's obscene, or when you're in deep trouble, or you made a giant financial decision or mistake, you inherited a business that's failing, has all this, or this giant lien on your property, whatever the case might be. That's where we see people get into trouble. And the idea of making that stuff more reasonable, and I think that would make a huge difference.
And bankruptcy was created to protect people, not to destroy them. Bankruptcy was not created so like, well, you tried in life, that's the end of it.
Yep.
It is to give them a framework for redemption. Like it's going to impact your finances for 7 years and your credit reports and all that kind of stuff. But it gives you ability to get back on your feet. So whether it's a business and it's Chapter 11, individuals with Chapter 7, I think those are the right numbers. Then but it allows them to get back on their feet. So there's a redemptive heart behind bankruptcy. Yeah. But I think that where it fixes is on the other side, the organizations that are loaning the money, they're going to have better thought process.
That's super good. And I think that's oftentimes, I talked about earlier that people have temporary needs. I had an outreach pastor tell me this once, and it really has shaped a lot of my worldview, where he said there are temporary needs, and it's called giving people things. It's you need socks, bottles of water, you need things like that. Like if I'm going to go to where I lived in San Diego at the time, you go to the gas light district in downtown San Diego, lots of temporary needs. People need water, warm clothes, food, and a lot of like rapidly accessible food that doesn't take a lot of prep time. They need all this stuff. It's like, that's great. I will 100% of the time spend money there. It's like, more than that though, what people need is empowerment. They need an opportunity to make their life better. They need systems to be able to do that. It's like, and that's where I want to spend the church's money. It's like, I'll do the temporary need thing because that's great. I want to create better systems that help people accomplish, a victory over poverty. Right. And I feel like like going back to what we were talking about earlier, is like, if we're going to be Americans, if we're going to say like, we're all in this together, we're a team, we all do the national anthem, we're under the one flag, which I think is beautiful. I think we should. It means we should care about those people and create a system to have them, do better. And I think those are great ways to do it. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
One last quick thing. It's funny you're talking about San Francisco and like socks and stuff like that. There was a pastor years ago, I think he was in Portland, and I heard him speak at a conference, and he goes, we have a ministry called Socks and Cigarettes. Nice. And they collected socks and cigarettes for the homeless. Sure. And people lost their minds. And he goes, people are losing their minds about the cigarettes. He goes, why we did it is because homeless people will take cigarettes off of the ground. They'll find them in things and they'll use them and they'll smoke them. And he goes, they'll get sicker than everyone else. Their immune system's already compromised. if we can provide something so they don't do that, he's like, you can physically see them get healthier because of that.
Yeah.
And he was like, we care about the long-term health, not the momentary, and he's like, obviously we don't want them to be addicted to cigarettes, but we don't want them doing that.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting. It's like always a perspective, right? Like if you just look at something and go like, that church gave people cigarettes, they're evil.
If that's the headline, you can see how that could be quite shocking. Yeah.
You take a step back and you go, oh, they had a bigger picture.
Yeah.
We want them to get healthier. We want to have this relationship so that we can lead them out of homelessness. And again, the things like that shape your mind where you go, you know what? Younger, immature me would have saw that black and white and judged them. More mature goes, no, there's nuance.
You can see the nuance in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, that is really the whole point of this podcast. The reason why we talk about it, I could be wrong. We want to create opportunities for people to get healthier in their communication. Rather than, I know in my own life, I grew up in the age of the internet where the way I talked to people was informed by how I talked to people on the internet. Being in proximity to Christian leaders and people who had a high moral ethic and the way that they spoke to each other has done wonders for me in my marriage, in my friendships, with the way I engage with people on the internet. And that's what this podcast is for. It's to exemplify, how do we talk about difficult things? How do we do it in a respectful way? How do we do it with an open hand? And we hope that was accomplished today. I hope you're encouraged by it. If you enjoyed it, if you found value in it, share it with a friend, share it with anybody who you think might be interested. And we hope to see you again next week.